Hello and welcome to this update on the Meols Viking boat project. The question many people asked when the project began was, do I think we'll actually find the boat? My guarded reply was that if the boat was there, we would certainly find it. Quick spoiler alert, there is indeed a boat there, and we have actually found it. Or perhaps one should say that we have found a very large boat straddling the entrance of the railway inn, leaving many traces available for us to find. Steve Harding and Tim Baldock, both local lads, picked up this story decades ago and have relentlessly sought to establish if the story was indeed true. I was already working with Wirral Archaeology on the Brunanburgh project and happened to suggest that before thinking about digging a big hole, we could try augering. This would tell us if indeed there was a boat and exactly where it was and just how deep it was. I also showed them some pieces of 6th century wood that I had recently excavated. These large pieces of timber had the strength of a meringue, and when dried they would shrivel by 90%. I suggested then that there might not be very much left of surviving material, and what was there would be ultra fragile. But undeterred, Wirral Archaeology, led by Davina Davitt, did not hang about, and 6 months later everything was put in place and work began. It had to be in February to avoid disrupting the pub, which, as we know, that weather and that coast is wet and windy, but we got very lucky with the weather. Before any field work, there is a stage called desktop study. This helps to define the area to be investigated, and it is vital to define the questions that the project will address. Old maps are invaluable, as there was a navigable river from the coast to Wallasey Pool. This meant that boats could have made it up to where we were looking, but it was also near the coast, and so we would need to check that there wasn't a harbour or an outlet to the sea at that point. Measuring the depth of the cellar also allowed us to work out just how far the trench wall would have gone out, which is actually where the piece of the boat was originally identified. But the engineering drawings also had something a bit alarming for me, in that they had the rainwater, the foul water, the electricity, the gas, internet. They all entered at exactly the point where I was very interested in augering. So I was aware that we were going to have to be very careful and possibly thread our auger between these various obstacles. So the project had 3 questions that I hope to answer. Was there a boat? If so, could the size and shape be defined? And lastly, could one account for the boat actually ending up here? We're going to be talking quite a lot about augers, so let me quickly show you what I'm talking about. It is a great tool for looking at the different areas below our feet. But the trouble is, it takes a very small sample. I want you to imagine looking through a keyhole when you have to stand some way back. The view is actually very limited. So we would have to be very alert to the subtle changes when, for example, we pass through a thin plank of wood that we were hoping to find. That is where the auger, we hoped, might capture some samples. Understanding the layer below our feet is very important to this project. Sand, for example, comes in many colours, as well as in different shapes and sizes, and the mud that flows downriver, which I will often refer to as alluvium, is quite different from clay. And clay itself is important because it helps to seal organic material, to limit the way that will break down, mainly by excluding oxygen. And remember, water is absolutely full of oxygen. That's how fish manage to breathe. Our clever geologist, Mike, spotted that the sands illustrated on this slide looked very different under his microscope. Some were rounded, some were sharp, some graded, and some of very mixed sizes. To a geologist, each of these tells a different story, and later we will see that one surprising story absolutely fitted with the other evidence that we discovered. So on day one, we needed to understand the subsurface layers, and that would tell the story of the site. This would provide our first check about the boat. It would tell us if there were also other boats, or indeed this was a harbour location at this point. What we discovered is the wonderful profile of the silted up River Birket. So that answered the first question. A big boat could easily have reached here. The blue clay at the base was also important because it gets that colour because it excludes air. And by excluding oxygen, that was vital if we were to have any chance of finding any traces of wood. There were also some suggestions of a violent event like a tsunami, which could have dumped lots of material into this basin. And that again is something that will emerge later on. So far, so good. But Alan and his groundswork team, who were preparing the augers sites ahead of us, hit concrete on day 2. This was not entirely unexpected. On the first day, I had asked one of the WA members, Jay, who was an experience as an army engineer, to try drilling sideways, something I've not seen anybody try before, and it worked remarkably well. The equipment ran straight and true, and if provided of course the technique used was correct. What this illustrates is the culprit. What we actually found was that there was this great slab, and almost certainly it is the base for that crane you see illustrated in the slide. Slab obviously blocked any direct drilling, but even worse, it might well have squashed the boat because it was not anchored to the main structure. So it could have acted like a slow hammer as the ground dried and filled with water. And any long buried wood, as I mentioned, is extremely fragile and extremely vulnerable to the introduction of new water carrying more oxygen. This movement would have allowed the oxygen to circulate around, break the seal. So my prospect, my thought that we would actually find chunks of wood was greatly diminished by this discovery. While we negotiated with the railway inn to drill right in front of their porch, which was the only way to get in underneath the various services, although it would block the main entrance, we nevertheless continued to drill all the way around this slab. And the slide shows the various places in green where we actually were doing the various bits of drilling. You'll notice in these slides that we've inserted pieces of drain pipe through the surface rubble, which eliminates the contamination that falls down the hole. It also gives us a nice precise measurement, and you'll see that we're taking great care in all the photographs you take. You will notice that we take great care to get the heights precisely right. This will prove to be extremely important when we come to try and plot the bits of wood that we do find, but that's about 5 meters below our site. Centimeters count. The deep samples from these cores started to produce a jumble of wood fibres where the boat was suspected to be, but there was no wood. When we were able to drill underneath the slab itself, they produced even more evidence of wood, plus the different material inside and outside the boat. If indeed one can start to use the term inside and outside the boat, there was clearly something there. Something had disrupted the subsurface geology. Something was going on below, but the evidence was insufficient at that stage to say it had been caused by a sunken boat. I am a great believer in the wisdom of groups, so on day 4 I called a halt to work and explained the problem. We were almost certainly hitting where we thought the boat should be, but the evidence we were gathering was just not good enough. We certainly didn't have any solid lumps of wood. 2 ideas emerged from the group. The first was to try the 7-centimetre auger tips rather than the 2.5 gouge that we've been using up to then. This would allow bigger samples to be extracted and without the churning of fibres that was necessary to extract the thinner cores, which we had to rotate in order to stop them falling out. I, however, noted that it would be very, very hard to get this wider auger through the troublesome black layer of sand which capped the site, and even harder to extract such a big auger from within the very sticky mud inside. This is where the second but brilliant idea emerged. Joe Potts had a quick word and then slipped off to his workshop and quickly returned with Mark I yoga or auger yoke. Tongue twister there. This allowed up to 6 people to put their backs into extracting the core. After some overnight modifications, Mark II auger yoke allowed some great samples to be collected. There you see an illustration of the auger yoke there, and this is me briefing everybody on the problems that we were having, fortunately captured. So we're now on to plan C. When the first undisturbed core was extracted later on that day, after careful washing, it revealed the layers of well-spaced wood fibres, and more importantly, these were horizontal, which is exactly what I have expected if we had passed through some planks. However, it was now horribly clear that the evidence that we needed was going to be very fragile, that it only survived at great depth. So these cores would have to be carefully processed by me off-site. So I asked the team to wrap up all the future cores, and I would take these away for careful assessment in a controlled environment. The slide here illustrates some of what emerged. You'll see on the right-hand side the bench that I developed. I first tried putting some gentle spraying equipment onto the cores, but that was just too aggressive. They fell apart, or some of them fell apart too quickly. So instead, I got some misting equipment, and this very, very slowly etched the surface to reveal the very fine surface details. What I saw and recorded were the marks of surviving wood, where the structure, the wood had all rotted away, remember, that the structure had been replaced by different materials as the various components of wood rotted away. Some bits, such as this lump, were obviously not planks and might indeed have been parts of the prehistoric wood material which we were encountering in considerable quantity at various depths. We know that this was washed ashore, so I didn't take it particularly seriously at that stage, but nevertheless I collected all the fibres, and this illustrates really well just how little wood survives even inside the clay, And that, when this great lump was washed, that's the total surviving quantity of fibres. But this piece of data was very important because once the boat shape was defined, the relevance of this piece of wood became clear. In fact, it's a piece of the rib and floor of the boat. So this illustrates just how necessary it is to have a careful and consistent and non-discriminatory. You can't decide what the relevance of a piece of data is when you're processing it. You just have to record everything, and it's a really pays dividends that one does. Planks, however, were quite different from the random bits of wood, and they were particularly exciting. They were flat and they were relatively thin. In several cases, it was possible to measure the angle of the impression left in the wood by the plank. And this here, it's quite hard to see, but just under the very gentle misting, you can see the grain of the outside of the plank. And what's left there is a little bit of the sand that separated these two layers before they came apart. This allowed me to actually make an assessment of how thick the planks would be. And as we will see shortly, sometimes the gap actually closed. So I wasn't always lucky enough to actually have a gap, and all I had was where the gap had been. It was tricky work. But having gathered all of that data, now time for a little bit of plotting. The vertical cores, which we used on day one, to allow us to see what the riverbed, to identify the riverbed indeed, were all assembled on site. However, these deeper cores were taken away and were reassembled in 60 centimetre sections to fit into the misting bench, which we saw earlier. The accumulated field records, one of which I illustrate below, were then plotted on A3 size pieces of graph paper, all the time checking with the various finds, the sample logs, to draw each profile. But once all these had been plotted, the time had arrived to try and join up the evidential dots. It was quite a tense moment, I confess. Would all these auger dots actually line up with each other? Would I come out with a coherent story? To my great pleasure, the planks, as I am now going to call them, were traced and plotted. The angles and the depths really lined up remarkably well. This made all those cold, wet winter days outside with the cores worth it. We had what we were looking for. We had very much a very clear impression of a clinker-built boat, which is what we were looking for. This is constructed of lots of different planks. If you look at this on the right-hand side, you can see the clear fractures running through of the various different planks, but no gap in between. All that there is the remains of a rusty nail. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about nails in a few moments. Whether it was luck, inspired guesswork, or sheer genius that guided the different augurs to hit these vital bits of evidence, these bits of wood, or where wood had been, these planks, I will leave you to judge. But perhaps that little bit of geometry learnt at school came in handy for some late night calculations to decide just exactly what angle we should drill the next auger at. So we had some very clear evidence of overlapping planks, and indeed on one or two occasions, on two occasions I should say, the auger actually ran through a place where there was not one, but there were actually evidence of two planks overlapping each other. So this was very clearly a clinker built boat, or had been a clinker built boat. but the evidence was so fragile. Even with a mist of water and sand, the gap very, very, very quickly washed away, and one had to stand over it to observe and draw and note exactly what was happening. Deeper cores, I'd mentioned earlier, where we had the proper clay, um, they were quite different. And 2 days in the misting bench did not move one drop of the clay. So I then, for these last few, I had to restore the spraying, but even that didn't achieve a great deal. It was a very, very slow process, and my neighbours objected to the fact of me leaving the machines running all night, as it was really quite noisy. It took a long time. Whenever one reaches a tentative conclusion, it's very important to start testing it immediately before you get carried away and start telling everybody. And one thing I could do is that we did have, in several of the samples, we did have quite a number of pieces of iron or concreted iron. Once the boat outline could be plotted based upon the plank evidence, I could start to look at where these pieces of metal had turned up when in the sieves as we'd washed things out, and really got a very nice match between them and the surface of the boat. I then did some quick checking of the notes, and knowing the shape of the hull, I opened 2 of the sealed samples, and to my great joy, inside those were some lovely bits of iron. One was nicely concreted. The other one actually just concretion rather. The other one had an actual piece of iron running through it with the concretion on the outside. We all know that rust takes over and destroys iron, particularly when there's oxygen about. Even in anaerobic conditions, which this had been in, the iron is still taken away and turned into this extremely hard material, which is called concretion because that's as hard as it is, very, very hard indeed. Interesting point. We've already noted that there is very little actual wood to be found. The Sutton Hoo boat was actually defined simply on the basis of the surviving iron rivets, while the Skulderlev boat, about which we're going to hear a lot in a little while, they actually excavated 6 boats, and they say that there was no surviving iron, according to the archaeologists, although archaeologists are not always that brilliant at finding iron. I have put some large pieces of iron or large lumps of concretion. All you can see is that stuff on the outside inside a CT scanner, and the void, or the very small amount of surviving metal inside, actually shows the original shape. And perhaps we'll do this with some of these pieces later. Now, having established and taken you almost to what seemed like the end of the story, we have to go off at a slight tangent now and actually wind back to a stage before the boat had actually been plotted. We were actually under some time pressure to spend the carbon dating budget. So what we gathered is a small team from Wirral Archaeology together at the Nottingham University laboratory of Steve. Because we didn't actually know which bits of wood belonged to the boat, the sampling strategy I devised was to date some pieces from just above the boat and some from just below the boat, and then to do a number of pieces in between. The theory was to give a date range into which the boat would fit, and then hope that some of the bits of wood between these gaps would actually be from the boat itself. It was a great theory, but the boat had another great surprise to spring on us. That gives you again some idea of the sort of fibres that we were looking at. Before I go into that, I just want to say a little bit about carbon dating. It is a wonderful, wonderful way of accurately assessing the amount of the surviving carbon-14 isotope in the sample. But in order to turn this into something meaningful, we have to use the various calibration curves that have been developed over the decades, where, starting with modern trees, by matching the tree rings over 1,000 generations of trees and measuring the actual amount of carbon-14, a real-world picture of the amount of the dates, calibration can be evolved. Climatic change, solar activity are just two of the causes of the balance of CO2 in the atmosphere changing. And of course, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is the amount of is the stuff that then gets involved into the piece of wood or plant that you're dating. Sometimes the date can be wonderful specific, as you see from the top plot here. It doesn't intersect anywhere on the calibration curve, but others you will see have a very wide spread. It's not that the carbon date is vague. The carbon date is right. It's because at that time the climate was doing something very strange, and it leads to it means that you can't be absolutely confident and pinpoint a particular date. However, for our purposes, such fine details turned out not to be that relevant. Just to remind you, the plan was to have pieces just above and just below where we thought the boat range was. It was a great theory, but all the dates were far too old for any sort of boat. I mean, they predated any boat that's ever been found anywhere. But I was not dejected. Good data doesn't lie. The challenge is to find just what that data means. It's telling you that your model is wrong, but it might be telling you something unexpected, something really interesting. So once one began to look at these dates in detail, what was clear is that they were upside down. The older stuff was above the younger stuff. That is not the way things are supposed to happen. We knew already that very old material, in fact, material of exactly this date, was to be found offshore in sunken lost forests, both off the Wirral and the Fylde coasts. This research had also suggested that there had been various surges of water, although no so far have actually been dated. So this is unique and very important, what we have found. A surge had stripped the layers out at sea, starting with the youngest layer, washing them to shore, and then dumping them into the hull of the boat. Then, on top of that young wood, the following older wood that had been stripped from further out at sea was brought along and had been dumped and deposited on top of the younger wood. We had a wonderful inversion. The trick was to now understand what this could possibly mean. The interpretation I am putting forward is that our boat was not abandoned here. Wood from boats was normally repurposed, as can be seen in many ancient timbered buildings in places like Chester and York. There is even some limited evidence of the planks on the side that we were looking at where we were doing the augering had actually been pulled off and been used to make a walkway beside the reworked river, and that explains the gap we have at the top of the planks of the boat that we're looking at. Wood is very biodegradable and will normally just rot away. The dating evidence, therefore, can best be interpreted by saying that a surge from the sea had picked up the younger wood, deposited in the hull, and then covered it with the older wood that had been scoured as this surge progressed, leading to the inverted date profile that we discover. This isn't not our boat, obviously, but I'm just illustrating. I wanted a picture to illustrate what could happen to a boat if you just imagine that being overwhelmed by a surge of material coming in from the sea. So this had given an answer to one of the objects of the investigation, which was to see and explain how the boat came to rest here. While we were in Steve's lab, before moving on, I just want to show you a little bit more about some of the science behind the stuff that we did. The acidity, for example, was about what you'd find in a cup of tea, which is in nature really quite strong, although Coke and lemon juice are about 3 on the pH scale. What we discovered, what I encountered here, was far, far higher than any I'd encountered on any other site where I routinely test the pH, which is the acidity measure of the soil. All of the tests we did, the acidity, the oxygen, and the absence of iron pan, all of these suggest that the conditions were absolutely ideal for the rotting of wood. So the fact that we found no wood is in the upper layers is absolutely clear. And I thought it would be interesting just to throw in this slide here in the top right-hand corner, because you can see that even that what was started out when it was taken was first blue clay. It's already gone grey, and the oxygen is already penetrating to turn it red, which is the colour of thoroughly oxidized clay. So we now understood, and we now confirmed that really the chances of finding any wood were indeed scientifically very, very slim. As we didn't have a date for the boat, I had to look somewhere else, and I had a profile, and I was able to compare this with the very limited number of wooden boats that have survived. I say that again, it is very, very, very rare for boats of this era to have actually survived. And there was really only one place where we could find clinker-built boats, and that was from the Viking era. So we probably had a Viking era boat. Now, this really brings me to summarize where we've got to. There's still more to be analysed and still more to be plotted. I note this, there are still some series of augurs that have not been plotted. What we've got so far are just the ones from the side. So we have nevertheless a confident picture that has already emerged. The boat was swamped by this surge that I was mentioning, and then that pressed it into the clay, and that is what allowed some of the keel material to be preserved. And we'll look at that a little bit more when we revisit the sketch that was the starting point for this whole investigation. The rest of the fabric, everything above the clay, has rotted away, but as illustrated earlier, enough evidence survived to give me enough planks to be plotted, and when they are plotted, they really trace out the side of a boat extremely well. The voids that have been filled, particularly in the upper layers, were great. At some of the lower layers, I found little bits of peat or lumps of peat had held the space open. But as you saw, actually, once you get down into the top bits of clay, the wood has gone completely. There's no wood to be found. So that is the outline of the shape of the boat that I'm showing, and you can see just how intrusive the clay is. And as I will show you a little bit later, this is the bow of the boat, but this would all have been above the level at which any wood would have been preserved. So there's actually wood. I'm quite optimistic that there will be much more underneath here, and indeed I'm rather hoping that we will find some more in these other series have suggested that we might even return. So that is where we are up to right now. Let me just point out one other thing, which is this dotted line here. This is the probable line of the excavation that was necessary to dig out the basement, to dig out the foundations into which the basement itself, the cellars, the beer cellars, could be built. So that is where, and that is what led, as I point out there, that is the section where it was actually seen and sketched. So this is suggesting, the sketch here suggests a boat that's about 16 metres long and round about 6 metres wide. And I say it's like School Dev 1. So let's move on to see what it might have looked at. This is School Dev 1. We still want to get a date, and I'm really hoping that we'll be able to align the boat with a little bit more precision. But the dimensions that have emerged suggest that it really is very similar indeed, very, very similar indeed, to this School de Lev 1, which is available if you want to go and visit it in the Roskilde Museum, which is quite near to a short train ride away from Copenhagen. You will notice that this boat has a better preserved side and a rotted side, and that is because this side was deeper into the mud, and of course we were attacking. This side was exposed to the elements, and you'll notice that very little of even that is preserved. And this School de Lev 1 was the boat on the bottom. The other boats had been scuttled on top of it. That's what this boat was used for. It was at the end of its life. Well, they had a life of around about 30 years, but when the boat was done and too leaky to be used, they sunk it to help protect the royal harbour of Roskilde. So to complete the circuit and close the circle, as I say, let's have a look and just see how well these tie up with what the sketches that we were given. What we know is that only the pieces pressed down into the clay, and again I'm suggesting that was because this surge really provided a lot of force and pressure to push this down into the clay. It's not easy to do that, but it would have taken quite some force, but this might have provided the necessary force to work that bottom bit into the clay. If we look at this, we find that all of the bits and pieces, all of the figures are really quite reasonably close. When you allow for the depth, the amount that the surface is built up, and allow for our datum and adjust the figures, they're not far out. And bear in mind, this was not a contemporary sketch. This was made some years later. The size estimate is somewhat shorter than the boat that we have, but bear in mind that, as I pointed out previously, we would have lost at least 4 meters from that, because the bow part of the boat had completely rotted away. The shape that he's drawn looks a little bit like a punt. Doesn't look like a piece of a Viking boat, but when you actually look at where it comes from on the boat, it doesn't actually come from the prow itself. It actually it fits very nicely with somewhere a little bit further back there. And when you look at the cross section that he sketched, it actually matches really very, very nicely the shape that we find in the School de Lev 1. Anyway, that brings me to the end of the update. I hinted at the fact that I was hoping that there would be a chance to do a little bit more work. Now that we know where the boat is, there is really a much better chance we can actually target particular things, whereas before we were hoping to find something. Now we know where it is. We can return to several of those auger holes, auger at a slightly different angle, and I'm quite hopeful that we will be able to tell a little bit more about the story, and indeed now to get some samples so that we can accurately date the boat. And dating that boat will also give us for the first time a date for this tidal surge, which is so far not recorded. Thank you very much indeed for listening. And I will be back with another update when we have more information.